All right. Good morning or good afternoon, or it's probably the middle of the night, so good evening. Um, I'll be talking about chapter 7 today. Chapter 7, remember, I split up into two halves. So the first video that you hopefully watched last week was on constitutionalism in England. That was one theory of government. Constitutionalism, remember, that was John Locke's idea. That was the idea of the king having limited power, the king sharing the power with the people or with parliament, having a set of written laws. Absolutism is the exact opposite. Absolutism was much more the ideas of Thomas Hobbes, that we need one strong ruler to keep people in check, to maintain stability, and this one monarch should have absolute or total power. And so absolutism means you have one person with total power. They oftentimes claim divine right. Within that word, or within that phrase, you see divine, which means holy. So divine right means these kings claim that they were chosen by God to serve their country. So any work that they're doing is the work of God. They would try to centralize government power. So they're the ones with all of the power. It's all centralized in their government. And then they would also try to limit the power of their enemies, especially nobles and the church. And this is wrapped up really well in a quote by King Louis XIV of France, who said, "L'État, c'est moi. I am the state. I am France. I am everything that I say or do, that's France, because I have all of the power." And so when we talk about absolute monarchs, this is a monarch with absolute power. They claim divine right, which means they get their rule from God, and so they are doing God's work. And so that means they are only accountable to God, not to the people, not to the written law, only to God. They oftentimes try to centralize government power, which means all the power goes to themselves. They're the ones who control the laws. They're the ones who control the courts. They're the ones who appoint governors and tax collectors and things like that. They also limit the power of their enemies. Their enemies are normally the nobles and the church. And then they oftentimes have a more efficient bureaucracy. That's how government is run. And so absolute monarchies, this is right around 1700. And so we talked about new monarchs a few weeks ago. New monarchs is monarchs beginning to centralize their power, beginning to gain more control. Absolute monarchs is when they really perfect it, around 1700. Our most famous absolute monarch is Louis XIV of France, nicknamed the Sun King. This was an emblem that he made. This is an emblem that he made of himself as the sun. This is him with, just his normal everyday attire. That was just, him wearing his PJs. And then this is me as a 20-year-old at the Palace of Versailles in Paris, France. Louis XIV built his massive palace at Versailles. This was a royal palace outside of Paris, about 30 miles outside of Paris. And he forced all of his noblemen to live at Versailles for part of the year, to work there. Now, in one sense, this was a reward for the noblemen. They are rewarded for their loyalty, rewarded for their hard work by living at this incredible palace. They get to serve the king. Like, what an incredible honor. But Louis XIV knows what he's doing. He knows that if the noblemen are at Versailles, if they're living in Versailles, he can keep an eye on them. And so Louis XIV had a network of spies that would watch the noblemen and listen to them and eavesdrop and try to figure out, are they loyal to me? And if not, he'll take care of that. Not only does having the nobles live at Versailles or work at Versailles, not only is that a way for the king to spy on them, but it's also a way for him to limit their real power, because they're not back at home. They're not trying to gain power back at home. They're not planning a coup or a rebellion. They're under his thumb. They're under his eye. They're controlled by the king. And so this was a brilliant move by King Louis XIV. The nobles thought they were being honored and rewarded, But really, the king is just watching them. He's controlling them. He's pulling the strings as if they were his puppets. And so this was a great way to limit the nobles' power. Some other things that he did, he centralized all of the power in him and in Versailles. So he controlled the nobles by forcing them to live and work at Versailles. He also would appoint people that were loyal to him to be the royal administrators or the officials in the government. So wealthy merchants who were called the bourgeoisie, that's a word that we'll become familiar with in the 17 and 1800s. He would make wealthy merchants his royal administrators or the government officials. Again, he's appointing people who are loyal to him so that they will do his work and do his bidding. He also raised very high taxes, not for the nobles, because he wants to keep the nobles on his side, doesn't want to piss them off, but for everybody else, super high taxes to fund his armies, to fund his wars. And anyone that opposed him, he's not necessarily going to kill them, although he might. He's going to exile them, kick them out of France so they don't have any real power. So what King Louis XIV is left with is a bunch of loyal servants that he controls and that he can manipulate. He also, one of his slogans was one law, one faith. So one faith, he gets rid of the Edict of Nantes. You might remember 100 years before this, 1598, the French Wars of Religion ended with the Edict of Nantes that granted religious toleration to Huguenots, to Calvinists. He says, on second thought, I don't want that. He revokes the Edict of Nantes, he gets rid of the Edict of Nantes, and he creates the Edict of Fontainebleau instead. The Edict of Fontainebleau says, France is a Catholic country. Only Catholics can serve in the government and only Catholics can have these privileges. The goal of this was Catholic unity. It was also a way to control the church and to get rid of anyone who might oppose him. Huguenots or Protestants. You see there are 250,000 Huguenots fled France to avoid persecution. Now, many of those fleeing Huguenots were skilled merchants. It's going to take a hit on the French economy. And many of them were French nobles as well. Again, it's a way for him to control the nobles. So Louis XIV, what does he do? He weakens the power of the nobility. He forces them to live at Versailles. So this means that the king can spy on them and prevents them from having real power. He also controls the church. The Edict of Fontainebleau, if I spelled that right, I'm missing a letter somewhere, basically creates Catholic unity. And then he controls the government in general. He appoints loyal officials, tax collectors, government, whatnot. He exiles any troublesome or opposition, and he raises high taxes. He would also appoint the tax collectors so that 97% or so of the tax money would come to him. In addition to controlling the government, controlling the laws, controlling the power, he also controlled the money, the economy. And this was an idea called mercantilism. We're going to explore the idea of mercantilism much more in chapter 9. But for now, I'm going to describe mercantilism, I'm going to define mercantilism as when the government controls the economy to benefit the crown or to benefit the state. So this means that King Louis XVI, he controls the economy. He controls the taxes. He controls all of the money, not to benefit Frenchmen, not to benefit French businesses, to benefit himself. Jean-Baptiste Colbert was Louis XIV's finance minister who was in charge of all of these policies. They created a more efficient tax collection. Beforehand, 25% of tax revenue made it to the king. Now it's 80%. I said 97% a minute ago. Hopefully you didn't notice. Jean-Baptiste Colbert also promoted domestic industries. That means he's encouraging French businesses, because if French businesses do well, The king can tax them and make money. Jean-Baptiste Colbert is also encouraging exports. An export, the prefix ex means to leave the port. Export is when you're selling French goods somewhere else, to England, to Prussia, to Spain. That's a way to make money. And Jean-Baptiste Colbert, he improves roads, bridges, and waterways. All of this is to encourage trade, trying to make sure that France has a strong economy and strong trade. So Jean-Baptiste Colbert helps French businesses grow with exports, with new roads, and things like that. Good for French businesses, sure, but again, King Louis XIV, he's the one collecting the tax money. And so really, who does this benefit? It benefits the king. Now, King Louis XIV, if he had just stopped, and if he had just enjoyed his money and his newfound power and his newfound wealth, he could have enjoyed such a lovely, pleasant life at Versailles, never would have had any issues. But absolute monarchs always want more power. And so Louis XIV tried to go to war, and that was going to be his downfall. His two main goals when going to war was to strengthen the Bourbons. The Bourbon was the royal family. Anytime you hear a Louis, there's going to be at least 18 of them. Anytime you hear a Louis, that's the Bourbon family. And then he also wants to weaken the Habsburgs. I hope you remember the Habsburgs. That's the royal family of the Holy Roman Empire, which at this point is mostly just Austria. And so Louis XIV is going to go to war to strengthen his own family, himself and his allies and family, and to weaken his enemy, the Habsburgs of the HRE. The main war that Louis XIV fights is the War of the Spanish Succession, right around 1700, you'll see. And the big question of the War of the Spanish Succession is, who will the next king of Spain be? It turns out through a series of marriages and alliances that the next person in line, the heir to the Spanish throne, Philip V, is the grandson of King Louis XIV. That means that if Philip V becomes the king of Spain, the Bourbon family would control France and they'd control Spain. It would be like a mega alliance of two of the strongest countries in Europe. This freaks people out. The other big European countries, you'll see England, the Holy Roman Empire, and the German states, they're freaked out because they're worried that France would get too powerful. The Bourbon family, if they controlled France and Spain, would get way too powerful. And so England, an Anglican country, Holy Roman Empire, a Catholic country, and the German states, a whole mix of different religions, they ally together to try to maintain a balance of power, to try to prevent their enemy from gaining too much power. The War of the Spanish Succession, for 10 years, these countries fight, and it ends with the Treaty of Utrecht. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 says, okay, Philip V, sure, he can be the king, he's the next rightful heir, fine. But France and Spain are forbidden to ever unite. They're forbidden to ever ally together. Not only that, France has to give up some land, and they have to give up some colonies over in the Americas. This was all, again, to maintain a balance of power. So basically, France lost. They lost the war. They couldn't ally with Spain. They had to give up land. They had to give up colonies. So again, when we're talking about the War of the Spanish Succession, I'll say it's right around 1713 or so. England, the HRE, and the German states ally together to try to weaken France. And the Treaty of Utrecht says, well, France loses, and they give up land and colonies. The goal of all of this, again, was to maintain a balance of power, to prevent one country from getting too powerful. This would prove to be the downfall for Louis XIV. You'll see he's going to die 3 years after this. And all of that money that he raised from trade and his tax collection, he wasted on the war. His son and grandson will have to inherit that mess which will eventually lead to a revolution. So again, Louis XIV is our best example of an absolute monarch. He weakens the nobles by forcing them to live at Versailles. He controls the church by kicking out the Huguenots. He controls the government by appointing loyal officers. He controls the economy with these mercantilist policies. And he tries to go to war as a way to gain more power, but that'll ultimately be his downfall. Now we're going to look at some other countries. So we can see France over here, France in Western Europe. They tried to ally with Spain, which would have been an issue. Now we're going to focus on Prussia. Prussia is the most powerful German state. Austria is labeled here as the Habsburgs. That's the old Holy Roman Empire. And then Russia all the way in the far east. So looking at Central and Eastern Europe. First, Russia all the way in the east. First, some context. In 1700, Russia was not as advanced as the rest of Western Europe was. They didn't have much trade with the West because, well, partially they were so far away. Partially, this water is incredibly cold, so they can't sail all the time there. They can't sail to the West because it's, you know, frozen tundra essentially. So they have little interaction, little trade with the West. And they had also just kind of maintained their traditions. They had serfs still. Serfs are basically peasant slaves. When Peter the Great becomes the Tsar of Russia, Tsar, T-S-A-R, is the Russian word for king, he quickly seeks to westernize the country, make it more like France and the West, and modernize Russia as well. Make it more advanced with a modern economy, modern government, and things like that. So what does Peter the Great do? Well, first he changes the culture. He creates some more Western ideas of etiquette. I should add that Peter the Great studied in France. He went to university in France, and so he studied French and Western European culture. And he copies those ideas. He says, okay, we're going to copy their ideas. Russian culture used to be kind of barbaric and primitive. The Russian noblemen would have these big beards that would go all the way down to the floor. They would spit all the time at the dinner table. They would scratch all of their body parts during the dinner. There wasn't the same level of etiquette and manners in Russia. So he says, okay, got to cut your beards. You got to trim your beards at least. No spitting at the dinner table. No scratching your butt at the dinner table. You gotta have some manners. He also gives women some more freedoms. Women used to have to wear a veil that covered their face. Very old-fashioned notions of gender. Now Peter the Great says, okay, you don't have to wear the veil. You're free to marry who you like, sort of. And so what he's really doing here is he's copying Western culture. He's copying French culture. He's looking to France and saying, how can I make Russian culture more like France? In addition to culture, he also wants to make the government more like France. And so he looks to the French and he says, okay, I'm going to have absolute power like Louis. I'm going to control the army like Louis XIV does. I'm going to control the economy like Louis XIV does. So he copies all of the things that Louis XIV did. So let's add some details here. Peter the Great, his goal here is to modernize and westernize Russia. So what does he do? He copies French culture. No spitting, no beards, no scratching at the dinner table. He also copies the French military and navy to make it more modern. He also controls the Russian church. He looks at what Louis XIV did with kicking out all the Huguenots, and he says, okay, I'm going to control the Russian church. I'm going to appoint the Russian Pope, essentially. Therefore, I control it. With the military, he forced peasants and nobles to serve. That was a way for him to control the nobles. You got to serve in my military. And perhaps the most important thing he did is he creates a meritocracy. The root of meritocracy, merit. Merit means your worth. If you merit something, you deserve it. Meritocracy basically means he's going to hire the best person for the job. Now, that wasn't the case in France. In France, with nobles, let me say this, before, nobles would be born into a position. They would inherit it. It would be their birthright. Now, with meritocracy, Peter the Great gives positions and offices to the best, the most qualified. It's based on merit, not based on wealth or birthright. This creates a more efficient government, a more efficient bureaucracy, because you've got qualified people doing the jobs, and it forces nobles to be loyal. They've got to serve Peter if they want to have these government positions. So this idea of a meritocracy, I'm going to bold that. I'm actually going to bold a few phrases. I'm going to bold meritocracy. I'm going to bold Versailles. I'm going to bold mercantilism and Colbert. And then our kings as well. Lots of key terms today. After Peter the Great, Catherine the Great is the next great Russian monarch. Again, they call themselves Tsar, T-S-A-R. And she continues what Peter the Great did. But she actually goes a little bit farther. Catherine the Great is sometimes called an enlightened monarch. We haven't gotten to what it means to be enlightened. But she basically tries to incorporate new ideas, new liberal ideas that might benefit all. For example, she creates hospitals, orphanages, and schools to, in theory, benefit everyone. But she also goes to war to gain land, mostly from Poland in an event called the Partition of Poland. Poland basically gets cut up between all of its neighboring countries. So you can see here, this was Poland. This part goes to Russia. This part goes to Prussia. Austria gets this piece, and so Poland basically becomes this tiny little piece right here. They get split up. This map also shows us how much land Peter the Great and Catherine the Great gained. So Russia used to be just this orange piece here. Now they're going to gain all of this land here and over here. Peter the Great doesn't gain much, but he does gain access to the Baltic Sea, which is a warm water port. That means that Russia can trade year-round. Catherine the Great gains all of this, plus this piece of Poland. So I'm actually going to add that real quick over here. They gain a warm water port at the Baltic Sea, which is good for trade. So again, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great successfully go to war to expand their territory, to gain more access to trade. All of these, again, are absolute monarch techniques, going to war to gain more power. All right, I feel like, yeah, last slide. The last one is Prussia. Again, just to clarify where we're talking about with Prussia. Prussia is the biggest German state. Germany doesn't exist yet, so Prussia is the biggest German state. The Prussian monarchs are confusing because they all name themselves Frederick. There's a Frederick I and a Frederick II and a Frederick the Great and a Frederick the Great Elector. Don't stress too much if you mix them up. I mix them up all the time. But let's just look at Frederick the Great. Mid-1700s, you'll see. How does he gain absolute power? Well, remember, one of the first things that an absolute monarch has to do is they've got to weaken their nobles. So what does he do? He forces the nobles to serve in the military. Prussian nobles were called Junkers, not Junkers, but Junkers. So this is a way for him to control the nobles. But the nobles still remain loyal because they don't have to pay taxes. And so this is a way to both control the nobles, put them in government positions, make them serve in the military, and gain their loyalty. No taxes, special privileges. He goes to war as well against the Habsburgs. He gains a piece of land called Silesia. So he creates a permanent standing army to go to war against the HRE against the Habsburgs. He also has some of those social reforms as well, kind of like Catherine the Great did. So he gets rid of torture. He creates schools. He creates religious toleration. And then he has some of those mercantilist policies as well. He builds roads, canals, and he encourages Prussian trade. And so when we think about absolutism, again, going back, and you can kind of pause this to get your notes, going back up here, what do? Well, they centralize government power. They're the one with all the power. They do that by appointing government positions, by raising taxes, by controlling the military, by controlling the nobles. They also limit the power of their enemies, the nobles and the church, by spying on them, or by making the whole country Catholic, by forcing the nobles to actually serve in the government, by controlling the church, and by perhaps giving them certain privileges like no taxes. And then they oftentimes go to war to try to gain power. Louis XIV, not very successful, but the Russians and the Fredericks in Prussia, both successful at that. And so you can see Prussia gains quite a bit of land under the wars of the Fredericks. They gain all of this land over here, Silesia from Austria, from the HRE. They gain this land from Poland when they split Poland up. And so Prussia is basically going to become the main the main German power. So I'll come here so you can pause and get those notes. Again, when you think about absolute monarchs, think about what techniques do they use? How do they gain absolute power? And then for Louis XIV, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and Frederick the Great, what specific examples do they do? If you can have maybe 2 or 3 examples for each, you should be set for this one.